Hi everyone, my name is Yami and I use they, them pronouns. I am the Network Engagement Manager at the Ontario Nonprofit Network, and I am so incredibly grateful to be in conversation with Haley. Haley, I'll let you introduce yourself in just a moment. For this vlog/blog, we are going to be talking about the work of LGBT Youth Line and the network gatherings that they have put together to support service providers that are 2SLGBTQ across Ontario, with an emphasis on rural and urban spaces across the province. Haley, but without further ado, please introduce yourself, and also happy Pride Month, everybody, and Indigenous Peoples' Histories Month as well. So, Haley.
Amazing. Thanks, Yami. Lovely to be in community with you and to have this conversation. So thanks for inviting us in. So hello, everyone. My name is Haley. I use she, her pronouns, and I work at LGBT Youth Line as the manager of provincial engagement. And I'm very excited to share more about what we've been up to at LGBT Youth Line in relation to finding ways to support 2SLGBTQ service providers who support 2SLGBTQ youth. So it feels very timely to talk about this during Pride Month and talk about some of these pretty huge challenges that we're experiencing within the not-for-profit sector.
Mm-hmm. And for folks who are curious, this blog is part of the Decent Work series to really engage with folks that are doing the work on the ground to support decent work. And so you can also link to the webpage to learn more about decent work, and we'll make sure to include that at the bottom. All right, so let's get into it. Haley, can you share a bit of the backstory of how Youth Line came to decide to host these network gatherings to support? Where did the need come from to support 2SLGBTQ, specifically service providers?
So first I'll say that LGBT Youth Line has been around for 28 years now. So we've been in existence for a very long time. We're a provincial organization that is led by 2SLGBTQ youth, that is for 2SLGBTQ youth. And we do lots of things at Youth Line. Our main service and what folks usually know us for is our peer support helpline. So 2SLGBTQ young folks can call, chat, text, or email to speak with other 2SLGBTQ youth who are trained as peer support workers. So that's kind of like our main service, or support. But a couple of other things we do include like leadership programs. So, having cohorts of 2SLGBTQ young folks to build community and learn leadership skills through like 8-month to year-long programs. We have a resource database that's front-facing. So for anyone out there that's looking for 2SLGBTQ specific supports that have been vetted by our team at Youth Line, you can check out our resource database. So that's just kind of like in a nutshell what Youth Line does. So I wanted to provide that context just because we've been doing this work for 28 years as like a workplace that only employs and has volunteers that are part of this community. 2020, we launched a 2SLGBTQ plus youth needs assessment that just told the stories and told the experiences of 2SLGBTQ young folks throughout the province and the needs that we have throughout the province. So there was 1,200 youth that participated in that needs assessment. And in 2020, right before the pandemic, we did an 11-city launch tour where we actually traveled to different communities with youth ambassadors who were part of one of our leadership programs to share the information that we learned from this needs assessment. So we did in-person launches March 2020 to 11 different communities throughout Ontario, and we invited service providers. We invited politicians. Not very many of them showed up, but many service providers were there. And so what we were finding is that the majority of service providers that attended were also 2SLGBTQ. So they were 2SLGBTQ service providers who were supporting 2SLGBTQ youth. So what service providers were telling us was that they were burnt out, isolated, not feeling safe a lot of times, especially within more rural and or northern communities, and just feeling I think the biggest theme was just like the incredible isolation, like the isolation in doing this work, and not knowing how to navigate that as service providers while also still trying to provide like the best supports that we can for young people. So we had a lot of those conversations, and those sat with us. Like as a 2SLGBTQ org, we experience a lot of these things too as workers and volunteers within this space. So anyways, fast forward another year, we launched another report. It was online this time. It was our Do Better report, which has recommendations for change in Ontario. Service providers came to those online spaces. We had evaluation forms, same things coming up for folks. And now COVID on top of that. So like the incredible isolation and lack of support and lack of safety and lack of connection and community while trying to do work within our communities, because we, you know, many of us are 2SLGBTQ young folks. So just lots of conversations about that. So then at Youthline, we were like, what's our role? What's our role in this? So then we started talking about networks. We were like, can we put together a network? And so what immediately comes to mind when we think of networks is like a monthly or bi-monthly model where you have a meeting for like an hour or two. And mostly folks just like talk about updates to their programs or services they're offering for 2SLGBTQ young folks, maybe some opportunities for collaboration, and then we leave the meeting and move on. And we're like, that's not really, there's value in that, of course, but it's actually not, that doesn't feel like it's actually going to address the needs that are coming up for folks. And another conversation we were having at the same time is how oftentimes when we build like really meaningful relationships with other service providers, it's usually in response to harm in many of these spaces. And Yami, I was trying to think about how you and I met many years ago, and I actually think it might have been at a conference. And like most conference spaces are like, you know, white, cis, het dominated. Like the few marginalized, quote unquote, people in that conference space, we usually find each other. We find each other and we talk about the harm that we're experiencing in these spaces. And then you create these like beautiful relationships. Like, so we also were tired of that dynamic where we're like, we find our people, but it's always in relation to the harm that we've experienced. We don't want that either. We don't want to keep replicating these systems. So after like honestly like a year or more of planning and talking and thinking and probably overthinking, we found some funding and we were like, let's try service provider gatherings. With the focus honestly being relationship building and connection and peer support amongst service providers who are trying our very best to do this work. So that's what we landed on. So in the end, we had 3 service provider gatherings. Our first one was for 2SLGBTQ service providers who support 2SLGBTQ youth in rural, northern, remote communities throughout the province. So that was our first one. Our second one was for trans, two-spirit, gender diverse service providers who support 2SLGBTQ youth throughout the province. And our third one was for Black, Indigenous, and people of color who support 2SLGBTQ youth throughout the province. So very specific identities.
I really appreciate that, you know, that you folks were able to see a need. And I see this part of, you know, decent work movement building, seeing a need for 2SLGBTQ service providers, because they weren't all part of the same organization. It would be like, you know, one person from one organization, another. And like you shared at times, feeling that sense of isolation and also having to then support from a frontline perspective. And we know a number of other subsectors can speak to this reality. But I'm really curious as to why in your network approach, you chose to focus on relationships.
Yes, that's a great question. Honestly, I think because a lot of the spaces that service providers are invited to are very transactional, and they're rooted, a lot of times are rooted in like task-based, like we're often running, like we move very quickly within this sector because of the way that it's structured, because of our timelines and deliverables related to grants. So oftentimes it's like we, as social service workers, like our main task is to support 2SLGBTQ youth, and we feel that so deeply because we're part of that community too. And there's not a lot of spaces to actually connect and build those relationships and find ways to break down some of that isolation, find ways to bring folks together and actually create community instead of just having like the task-based, like the quickly moving points of contact that are strictly about what needs to be done in relation to work. And that's not what we wanted. We wanted an actual space that was dedicated for service providers. Because I think Youthline is in a unique position because we are a 2SLGBTQ org. Like our entire staff team, our volunteer team, our board, everyone is 2SLGBTQ. But throughout the province, and most of the folks that attended these gathering spaces, they're not from 2SLGBTQ orgs. They're from different organizations that have a 2SLGBTQ worker, or not even. You just have like a youth worker or a nurse who happens to be 2SLGBTQ and then is assigned by the entire organization that they're like the 2SLGBTQ point person.
Right.
So that's also a thing that happens a lot, where it's like that might not be your job, is like strictly only supporting 2SLGBTQ young folks, but because of lack of supports especially within smaller communities outside of the GTA, there's no one else doing that work. Like there's just no one else that is doing that work or is paid to do that work, or is like that's not their mandate. It's just they're thrown into that role because they care, and also because their workplace is like, yes, you're queer, trans, or two-spirit, you can do it, and then we do. Our goals of our service provider gatherings, number one was fostering community and building meaningful relationships. Number two was sharing knowledge and building capacity. Yeah. And then the third goal was responding to the need for a different future. So that was just the reality that like, we know that the not-for-profit industrial complex actually is not working. It's not working in the way that we need it to. We are hearing that from 2SLGBTQ youth. We are hearing that from 2SLGBTQ service providers. What do we do? What do we do? So having that space to have those conversations too, to be like, we're stuck within these confines. We're stuck within this rush, and these super, super violent structures of like continuous project output for future funding, and to like keep our staff and keep our services open, and like it's not okay.
Did you find that there was any distinctions between like the northern and rural contexts at all in relationship to the more urban centers, or like when speaking to racialized 2SLGBTQ I was going to say survivors, but frontline workers and Indigenous and Black, like what were some of the things that they were saying in terms of being frontline service providers and the needs within their sector?
I think the first thing that came to mind, Yemi, when you just asked that, for all of our different communities, the main things that were coming up was like isolation, safety, and violence. So I'll speak in terms of like your first question of like northern, rural, kind of small towns, like those spaces. For folks that are within these communities, and it's hard because we're often the only ones. In many smaller communities, it's like you're having to navigate predominantly organizations that you might be working for that are not actually like safer or safe spaces for like queer, trans, two-spirit service providers. And also within the community, it's not always safe to be visible in the way that we often are as well, working within these fields. And it also brings up the dynamics of like, if you are the only 2SLGBTQ worker, how are you finding supports for yourself as well?
I'm curious as to like, what's next?
So I'll start with like what is absolutely going to happen. So for each of the gatherings, so each gathering was 4 days long, back to back to back. We wanted that like very short, condensed timeline that's very intensive to be able to build those types of relationships.
Okay.
So on day 4 of each of the gatherings, we had a really amazing graphic facilitator join us. And we talked about the challenges or the changes that we'd like to see systemically in our workplaces. Okay. So really amazing conversations that spanned like 4 hours for each gathering. Our graphic facilitator, Hermeet, is currently working on finalizing those graphic facilitations. So we'll have 4 total, 1 from each of the gatherings, and then 1 that combines them all together, which will talk about what needs to change within this model of doing things, like systemically what needs to change. Not gonna lie, a lot of this is focused on funding and grants and what that means when that money trickles down to 2SLGBTQ service providers, and how that forces us to move too quickly and in ways that are not actually always supportive of young folk. We are hoping that these documents and these graphic facilitations can actually be used for folks throughout the province and beyond to advocate for what your organization might need, or what changes you'd like to see, to be able to apply for funding, or to be able to think through new creative ways to support staff, for example, for managers and EDs out there. So we want this to be like a community held like graphic facilitation report for folks to be able to use in ways that make sense for you. Part of the service provider gatherings was like finding different ways to evaluate if this experiment was actually helpful for folks. So one of the ways that we did that was like an evaluation form at the end of the gathering for folks to tell us what their experience was like. And so one of the ways that we had asked folks to share their feedback about the gathering was actually to write a letter to the gathering. So they were like, I cried through most of them. They were really, really meaningful, really beautiful. And there's one I'm actually hoping to share right now, just because I think it like really captures what we were trying to do. Yes. Okay.
Oh, that's exciting.
Yay. Okay, so this one was specifically from a participant from the Northern Rural Small Towns and Reserves Gathering. So I will read it. Dear Northern Rural Small Towns and Reserves Gathering, I thought I knew what I was getting into, but I was wrong in the most wonderful way. My goals and expectations were so focused on utility and practical application of information. I was hoping for connections, yes, but for tools and tips and info about delivering programs, reaching youth, quote, doing our jobs. When we began, we were asked each other to slow down, and it was harder than I thought it would be. I realized truths about my relationship with myself and my work that has been trying to come to the surface for a long time. You gave me the space to let them come forward and held me safely as they did. I will cherish those conversations where time went by 30 minutes feeling like barely 10, cramming reflections into the space we had, only barely glimpsing the full scope of our thoughts and feelings on different topics. I hold so dear the intergenerationality that we were able to bring into our conversations, calling upon transcestors and HIV/AIDS activism, the wisdom in the room from times and people gone by, to carry their strength into now and through the future. It was a gift that will carry me, and I hope that I was able to give into that communal gift in a way that others found healing and meaningful. I know our time together was brief, but it will stay with me for so much longer than our week together. I hope our paths cross again as we all move through our work in this difficult time. Being part of this space was a joy and a privilege. My work going forward will be to fully understand that I was part of it and that it could not have been how it was without me or any of us. I loved the gathering in all of its fullness. I am also called to love all of myself.
Wow, that is a very, I'm like trying to hold back tears.
Okay. Me too.
That is, thank you for sharing that. I think for folks to know the importance of gatherings, and the importance of validation around experiences within and outside of the workplace. So thank you for that.